Okay, back again, guys. Please get caffeinated up or nicotined up for this. I surely am. It's probably going to be nightfall by the time we're done with this video. That's because we're talking about Flock, okay? And Flock is super divisive topic right now for obvious reasons, and there's a lot to get into. I've been thinking, I've been thinking a lot about Flock and how to talk about it, how to try to maybe add something new to the conversation. I have noticed it does seem like there is a lack of. I'm not seeing very many actual law enforcement people talk about Flock, and I think that's to his detriment because I'm seeing a lot of people who, you know, are not law enforcement and they're talking about how effective they think Flock is or what using Flock is like, and they just don't have that user experience like a police officer does. I've had, like I said before, I've been a patrol officer for 3 years, and when I first came out onto the street was right as they had just started unrolling Flock cameras in my city. Okay, so I now have about 3 years of pretty extensive use with Flock, and I use Flock pretty much on a daily basis on my patrols to combat crime. So I feel like I have a pretty good. So I know I have a very robust firsthand user experience of the software, and we're going to talk about not only are we just going to talk about like what it actually is like to use Flock, how intrusive are its tools, what kind of tools do they actually have. We're going to try to capture too like the privacy concerns, the surveillance concerns, and how justified are those. And please watch the whole thing because this is quite a complicated topic with a lot of different variables, and as it stands right now, it's kind of the Wild West with these cameras. I do think that they rolled them out. I do think police departments have rolled them out a bit too quickly and abruptly, and I think that a lot of them had good intentions behind it, and a lot still do. But this is a pretty powerful technology that still needs to be fleshed out, and the Supreme Court still needs to make a lot of rulings on the nuances of this, and there are many. Okay, but we're going to start off basic. We're then going to get into a lot more complicated topics with Flock, and I'm sure even if I rant about this and talk about this for an hour or two or three or whatever it ends up being, I know I'll miss stuff, and I'll probably have to make a second or third or fourth video. But today we're just going to kind of do. You're just going to get an insight from a patrol officer who actually uses Flock. Okay, and I would say I'm a pretty well-versed user. Not every patrol officer even has Flock, or if they do have it, they don't even really know how to use it. It's not a complicated system to use, but a lot of cops you could hand them any new tool and they would just not learn that tool because certain cops just don't want to, certain cops just have, if I'm ever afforded a new tool that is going to aid in my ability to capture criminals, find criminal activity, help bring a case to the prosecutors, then I'm going to use that because that's my job. As long as it's within the confines of the law, and so I have used Flock pretty extensively and heavily, and I think I would be a good person to speak on it. But like I said, not every officer even has access to Flock, or if they do have it, even really knows how to use it. So first, let's talk about how we even got to the point where police departments were kind of so seemingly quick to adopt these Flock cameras. It did seem to happen kind of fast. Now, I work for a major capital city, like I've said before, and I think when we talk, so think about, the area I work in, because every area is going to be different, okay? But the fact that I am in a major high crime city of the United States, with a lot of people in it, it's going to be relatable to a lot of other big cities in this similar scenario. But I think I can kind of conjure a few reasons why these big departments specifically were so quick to adopt Flock. The first major thing is there's a massive shortage right now of patrol officers, just officers in general, patrol detectives, specialty units. All across the board, there's a shortage of officers, specifically in the major cities. I don't see as much of an issue on a lot of outlier cities for various reasons. I think some of those are quite obvious to people. But the major cities have huge problems with manpower, particularly in policing. And we'll do another video on why that is. But the fact is there is a big shortage of officers. And because of that, crime fighting is extremely difficult, okay? And a lot of crime, especially lower level crime, goes by the wayside, is not looked into, and is not solved. Response times are a lot higher in a lot of agencies because manpower is so thin. There's a much less traffic enforcement. There's much less enforcement in general, and officers are just kind of designated to respond to, high priority calls, very violent scenarios, with less manpower. So we're in this kind of climate right now, especially over the last 6 years, where manpower is taking a huge hit. And then coinciding with there being a big hit on the numbers, these major police departments have also implemented a lot of policies that are very restrictive on police. Much more restrictive than the Supreme Court is, than the law is. And that could be a whole other video in itself. But just to kind of give an example of what some police departments are doing that are restricting officers from even doing their job. Not only obviously are police hyper scrutinized, but now there are a lot of policies in these big departments that are usually not written by police officers, but written by people who often have no law enforcement experience, and they're just people appointed to positions of government. And I will name just one policy in specific that I'm held to, that I know other big departments are held to as well, that has kind of put us in a weird spot with crime fighting. And this is just one of them, but a major one, and how it is at my police department, if I pull over a vehicle for a traffic infraction, and that vehicle flees from me, I am not allowed to pursue that vehicle. Okay, I have to literally turn my lights off and turn my car in the opposite direction and drive away. I think a lot of people don't know that that's the case in a lot of places, and it is. And obviously, you can see the implications of that. Any good officer, any officer that has any time on the road, and most even just normal people, can obviously see that, if somebody is fleeing for a minor traffic violation, or if they're fleeing from the police, there's some serious criminal activity going on. That's obvious. But not only am I not able to chase vehicles that flee from me for minor traffic violations, there are also many misdemeanors that I am technically allowed to, but the chase will be terminated almost immediately. We're also not allowed to chase for stolen vehicles alone. So if I see a car in front of me and it's stolen, and that's all I have for the vehicle, I just know that it's stolen, and I go to pull it over. If that vehicle takes off from me, which they often do, I have to turn my lights off and go the other way. and that's usually accompanied by getting flipped off by that person, and accompanied by all the citizens around me thinking that, what are the police doing? They're just absolute cowards. And I completely understand why they would think that, but that is held to a standard to where if we violate those policies, we'll be fired. So, and face pretty severe discipline on your record. So, and that's just a blanket statement. There's no exceptions in that. You cannot chase for a stolen vehicle alone. You cannot chase for traffic infractions alone. And we can get into the whole thing about like, well, you have the plate and you have the car description. Without getting into another video, most criminals obviously do not ride in vehicles that are registered to them, and they obviously steal vehicles to engage in more serious criminal activity. They do not want a vehicle that is registered to them. These people are always driving somebody else's car and always stealing cars because they do not want the crime that they're committing or about to commit to be tied back to them. So without ranting too far on that, those two main things, low manpower, and on top of that, that's just one of many restrictive policies on police that make police ineffective at solving crime. When these cameras started coming around, these police departments, a lot of them were like, they were like, okay, finally a tool that obviously has, that is quite capable, that we can utilize to catch criminals, on the back end, through a querying of data. And we're going to get into that. So that's why a lot of departments adopted it so quickly. And I think you can obviously see how, if those problems didn't exist, I think a lot of departments never would have adopted flock cameras. And I think many of them would be okay with giving them up if they had the manpower, they had the budget they needed, and they didn't have policies that were making it absurdly difficult to police the city. But moving on from that, that's where we're at right now. So these police agencies adopted these cameras. Okay, so now let's talk about, now that we know a little bit about why, some of the reasons they've been adopted, let's talk about the actual user interface and its actual crime fighting effectiveness as a police officer. I wish it would be so much easier to show you a screen grab of what flocks look like on my end. It'd be so much easier if you could just see like a ride along, which you should do if you can. If you have time, watch a ride along on YouTube or go to your local department and do a ride along. That is going to kind of help paint a picture far better than just me narrating what's going on, okay? But when I log into Flock, there are many tools I log into and I have access to as a police officer. As technology has progressed, there's always better and better tools. It used to be police didn't even have radios. It used to be police didn't have computers in their car. And, police wouldn't even know that they had a stolen vehicle in front of them or a criminal in front of them until, they were on their old handheld radio and they were announcing it, to dispatch, and they got back to them 10 minutes later about the status of, somebody's license, or if they were wanted, or if that vehicle was stolen. And it was very delayed and difficult to solve crime back then. And there are other nuances to that, but every police department nowadays, they've got CADs, they have computers, they've got radios, body cams. We have access to arrest records, probable causes, all these different tools that have quite private information. Just from running a plate, I'm able to see a person's full name, date of birth, home address, social security number, driving records. You also have access, and that you can then use that information to find access to criminal records, probable causes, other police databases, and that's that is why police are held to a high standard, because to fight crime and to combat criminals, you need to have better tools than them. You need to have a leg up on them, or the criminals will win. If you do not have better tools than the criminals, if you are fighting a fight if you are fighting criminals with the same tools that they have, it's going to be very difficult to win. So among many of the other tools that we have access to, Flock, I will say, is the most effective in my use in combating crime, all types of crime, whether that be finding wanted fugitives, people with warrants, whether that be finding narcotics traffickers, people who are selling illegal firearms or possessing illegal firearms, robbery suspect, carjacking suspects, home invasion suspects, especially hit and run suspects. Those crimes, pretty much every crime that involves a vehicle, which is most crimes, is greatly, the investigation is greatly supported by Flock. So when I log into Flock, there's kind of two categories of information. There's the automatic notifications I get from Flock by default, and then there's information that I can query myself and put into a hot list myself and get notifications from that hot list. Okay, so let's first talk about the automatic notifications. The automatic notifications are just kind of the easy ones everybody probably knows of with Flock, which is, Flock will be tied into a national database for your state that, has plates or vehicles that are listed as stolen, and it will notify you if a plate is registered to an individual that has warrants, if the registered owner of the vehicle has warrants. So the automatic notifications I get are mostly those. You can also get missing persons notifications. So what will happen is my city, and I know this is different, we're going to get into that in other areas. My city, from what I've seen, only has cameras at major intersections, okay? And so when you drive through a major intersection in one of these areas that has a camera, that license plate reader is going to take an automatic picture. If that plate has, on the back end, it has been flagged as stolen or registered to a wanted fugitive, that's going to push out a notification to my homepage. And it's going to show me a picture of the license plate, a zoomed out picture of the vehicle that it's attached to, and a picture on the map of where it's at, like the intersection. And then the only other pieces of data it's going to give me is the time at which it flew through, at which it drove through there, and the direction of travel, whether that be north, south, east, or west. Now, quite frankly, it's automatic features. That's really actually not a lot of crime police run into. And that's on two accounts. Overall, that's just a small fraction of crime is stolen cars, stolen plates, and wanted fugitives registered to the vehicle. And kind of like I pointed out, another part to that is most stolen cars, as soon as they're stolen, the plate is swapped out. So they will not be registered by the camera. Also, wanted fugitives, the smart ones, they do never, and most criminals, to be honest, they're not stupid enough to do this. Most criminals do not drive vehicles that are registered to them because they don't want the police running their license plate and seeing that there's a warrant attached to it for them. So on its most automatic features, there's really not a lot there. There's not even a lot of information shared, and that's just that's just updating live as it goes. And I'll say too, with all these notifications that are being updated live, it's not necessarily live. There is a delay. Maybe this is different in other cities. I have found that the delay is usually 30 seconds to a minute. So it's live adjacent, okay, but there is a bit of a delay to it. Now, where I think one of the privacy concerns that comes in, it's not on the automatic features. I don't think a lot of people have problems with that. I think a lot of people have problems with the ability to search these cameras, okay? And I can understand why. But right now we're just going to talk about what that's like to use. So, you know, if I then want to go further and find more than just that, 2-3% of crime, which is the stolen vehicles and wanted fugitives tied to the plate, I can query, I can look for license plates or vehicles. If I don't have a plate, but I have a vehicle description, I can query cameras in the areas I look in the areas I work in, to kind of narrow down and find a plate or find a vehicle that was associated with a crime that had just occurred or recently occurred. That's extremely useful. I think the ability to query vehicles and search them, a good officer, an officer who just some regular B cop who is kind of checked out and not really, very and doesn't like their job and is not fighting crime, this tool is absolutely useless for them. But somebody who's been on the street a long time, and they have experience and they understand how to find criminals and criminality, they all understand the importance of vehicles. Vehicles are such a nexus of crime. Okay, vehicles are, like I've said before, pretty much involved in some aspect of every crime, especially major crimes. So, an astute officer, having the ability to search through the system and have your own list, you can catch a lot of criminals that way. And I have caught a lot of criminals that way, and I know other people who have caught a lot of criminals that way that otherwise would not have been caught, either not at all or with a massive delay. And by massive, I'm talking days, weeks, months, okay, maybe even longer, okay? The flock cameras are honestly doing the jobs of, 4, 5, or 6 very good police officers. And it is saving, like a patrol officer like me or detective, hours and hours and hours of investigatory time for each case. And that's why it is so effective. So, as an astute officer, and somebody who's low on manpower, officers now have the ability to where when they're out on their duties, they may gain information that tells them that some type of criminal activity is tied to a vehicle, and maybe either they're behind that vehicle right now and they just don't have the time to pull it over because they're going to a domestic, they're going to a shooting, they're going to a robbery. Maybe they've got to go home because they've been working their ass off for all day and it's time to go home, and you can't catch every criminal. That now gives them the ability to, that gives them the ability to get that plate information, get that car information, put that into a list, and catch them another day. Okay, that's extremely useful, and it allows you to be notified, when you're in your area if the car is there, and then you can go and you can attempt to try to intercept that vehicle and see if that activity is still going on with that car, and then do what you need to do from there. And I know a lot of you are listening, and we're going to get into all the privacy concerns about all this. Okay. Now, so, and I could do a whole nother video on just how I use Flock and I could pull up specific cases on how I've personally used it to solve crime. That's just a brief overview of how that saves police officers a bunch of time and how effective it is. Now I'll also say, because of that feature, you can also see how I feel like people don't talk about this a lot. The Flock, in many ways, actually lessens the interactions the police have with the public with uninvolved people. And let me explain. So, let's just use this as an example, and you can see how this will play into many other investigations. Let's say I go to an armed robbery, and somebody got robbed at gunpoint, and they didn't get a plate of the vehicle, which is oftentimes the case, but they got a rough description of the vehicle. They're like, okay, okay, look, I was just robbed, and it was it looked like maybe a 2010 to 2015 black Chrysler 300. Okay, so with that information, if there are cameras nearby, I can then go into Flock, query, black Chrysler 300s in that area in the last, 6 hours, and I can get all of those. And then through other, investigatory tools, we can narrow down, let's say I get 10 Chrysler 300s. A good police officer is going to be able to find, even if there's 20, 30, 40, if you have enough information, you're going to be able to narrow it down to that exact car. And then when you find that exact car, you can get the exact plate. And even though, like I said, maybe the plate, usually the car is not registered to the person committing the crime, either way, we now have, oftentimes within the span of 5 to 10 minutes upon arriving to the scene, we have now gone from just having a general description of that vehicle to having the specific vehicle. Okay, so now how it used to be, instead of putting a bolo out for, all black Chrysler 300s in this area, and then cops going around and pulling over, as they, rightfully are, they have reasonable suspicion. They see an older model Chrysler 300 that's black. They pulled over thinking it might be involved. But there, like I said, there could be 10 or 20 of those out there. And there will be a lot of cars that get pulled over that aren't involved. And that's wasting the time of the officer. That's also wasting the time of the citizen who's just trying to go about their day. And with that information from Flock, now we can get the specific identification of the vehicle, or at least a good picture to where we're like, look, it's this Chrysler 300, but it has this sticker on the back, or it has this type of wheel on it, or there's damage to the side of the car. And I have example after example after example of us being able to precisely nab the right guy, the right criminal after a major felony because of Flock. And that is obviously a huge, and that person either would have gotten away, or we would have had to pull over a bunch of more cars, or there would have been a massive time delay, in finding out, what that car was, exactly which car that was. And then if you find, the car within a short time frame, it's likely going to be the guy who committed the robbery. And then when it comes to the prosecution of that person, since you're able to catch the criminal within a short time frame, they can't use the argument of like, well, I wasn't driving the car that day. I wasn't in that car, because you've caught them so close within the occurrence of the crime. So you can see that's just one example of how the cameras are very useful and how they actually can keep people who are uninvolved in crime from getting pulled into it, from getting pulled into some type of traffic stop. So let's get into some of the privacy concerns, and let's just kind of briefly state that, look, there are other videos to go into the legal, the exact case law on how we got to where these cameras are allowed in a lot of areas, and why there seems to be so little guardrails in place. This isn't the channel, this isn't the video to get super into that right now. There's plenty out there. But basically, as it stands, there is no, as the law is right now with the Supreme Court, there is no expectation of privacy on public roads. And because there is no expectation of privacy on public roads, that's what people say is the justification to be able to put these cameras on public roads. Now, I think that there's a lot of good arguments against that. A big one for me that I think we need to talk about is Flock has already kind of addressed this a little bit themselves. When Flock first came out, you used to be able to query data, I believe, at least 90 days back, and it might have been 120 days without a warrant. You just had to put in the box, your reason, and you're supposed to put a case number in there, which sadly a lot of people aren't doing, and I think that needs to be a must. I think if you're going to be querying data, you have to have articulable reason, and I think you should be putting a case number in there. But a lot of people were querying data all the way back to 120 days. I think that's obvious to a lot of people, that's obvious overreach. And now, as it is right now, just the basic patrol officer, at least for me, where I work, can only go back 30 days of history. Let me state too, these cameras aren't like cameras I can log into and look at live, and I cannot like pan and control around. I can just search the pictures they've already taken of the vehicles. So I also still think that 30 days, I think that there is a good argument, and I do think that 30 days is quite still long to be going back without a warrant, to be getting this data. And we're going to talk about more about the warrant's role in this and establishing probable cause. I think a lot of people would be put at ease if these police departments were just more responsible with the cameras and they just made the level of accessing the information probable cause and making you get a warrant. And I think that, you obviously could put in, a system to where, like I said before, like a robbery that just occurred, it might not make sense to have to apply for a warrant for that. Since the exigency is quite high, since the threat to the public is quite high, you should be able to query that live data or that data over the last few hours quite quickly, or if you have like an active shooter or anything like that. But I do think things that crimes are not in progress, they're not occurring right now, or there's been a delay, or maybe they're not major crimes. If you want to query older data, I think it's a no-brainer that you should be having to get a warrant to access that data. On top of that, if police departments aren't doing this, like I said before, I think that if you're just going to outright just start querying data and searching cameras, and you're not just going to use the automatic notifications, I think that the standard needs to be pretty high. Even if you're tracking something like I just said that's like quite exigent and quite in the moment, you should still be putting a case number or a valid reason associated with that search. Okay, because I do think people are right to be concerned of like officers just willy-nilly searching whatever. I think that they should have a reason associated with that. You should be able to find that reason and see that reason. In a way, and obviously this has to be done in a way that, I don't have the proper apparatus or the proper structure. The legal framework is going to get fleshed out as time goes on. If we, if communities choose to have flock, right now it's still kind of in its infant stage. And I think a lot of rulings are starting to be made. A lot of communities are deciding to get rid of flock cameras altogether. And I could see why, because, there is a high degree of responsibility having information like this, let alone on flock ends, which I don't know if this is the video to get into it. We might touch on it. I do think Flock itself as a company has its own serious problems with the hardware and software that other people on YouTube you can see have obviously pointed out, and that's got to be addressed, okay? It does seem like the software and hardware is vulnerable to attacks and manipulation. That's obviously got to get fixed. And if they are that vulnerable, then maybe police departments should consider shutting the cameras down until we're sure of its security and we're sure that this data is only being accessed by the government under the appropriate conditions and not by anybody else. Other privacy concerns. Like I said, my city, I think, has done a lot of good things with it in the sense that the cameras are quite sparse and they're only at major intersections. I see a lot of municipalities they have a lot of cameras just throughout the city to where it almost feels like it's a bit of a live tracking. I don't know if there needs to be a radius put on, like what that standard is. Like if you have a camera every mile or 5 miles, like that is acceptable. But you can see how if you put them too close together, it almost is like a live tracking feature at that point because you can see them turn by turn. I think that would concern me as a citizen. I don't think that would be appropriate. Another thing too is a lot of places I've seen have started to put cameras in parks, in public parks, Flock or just other cameras. I think that there's been a lot of uproar about that, and that seems completely justified to me. I think that if you are, a park is, a place that, people go to, to, get away from the city, to kind of have a little bit of an oasis. And obviously, while parks do harbor, a lot of criminal activity sometimes, due to its seclusion, due to its privacy, due to its being away from other eyes, private citizens still want to use that without being, encumbered, and without feeling like they're being surveyed at all times. I think that, if you are having such an issue with crime in like a public park, you just need to be putting an officer in the park. Okay, you need to be, and that kind of plays back into manpower issues. Is if we don't want the surveillance, we can't have both this this low level of you can't have both. If you don't have any officers and they don't have any tools, your crime is going to be really high and really dangerous, and people are going to get hurt. But like if you swing that pendulum the other way, and you have the appropriate amount of officers, you can combat crime, and then maybe you can also have less of the surveillance because you have officers out there who are able to do the job. But if you're, if you're both low manpower and you have bad tools or tools you're not used to, you are going to have more crime. I do think though that having cameras in public parks does feel really creepy, and I think that departments should probably get away from that. And if they're really concerned about the crime there, they need to put an officer down there. And Flock doesn't do this specifically, but just talking about automatic license plate readers in general, these automatic ticketing cameras, everybody hates them. I don't know what any government thinks they're getting out of that. Everybody absolutely detests that I've seen those automatic ticketing systems. They're not even effective because, first of all, like we've talked about before, people who chronically speed and drive without licenses and drive like assholes and do whatever they want, they do not pay tickets. They do not drive their own cars. And these automatic license plate ticketers, they just see you speeding, and then there's no disputing it. There's nothing. They just send you the ticket in the mail, and that affects the average citizen because the average citizen, is not. The average citizen is paying their tickets, and they are studious, and they are getting mail, and they're checking their mail, and they don't want their license status to be affected, so they pay those bills even if they weren't the ones driving them. And yeah, I have always, even before getting into policing, while in policing, I've always been against automatic ticketing services, and oftentimes it's not the police department who are issuing those out. Sometimes it is like states' departments of transportation and other departments that are doing that. I have just found that really destroys people's look on police, and I just don't see that being. I hope police departments get away from that. Something I would like to say too is that I see a lot of people online. I do think they're not distinguishing between the cameras that the government has access to and then what is just on private property. I have noticed a lot of private businesses, like especially these big retail stores, they're willingly, putting tons of flock cameras, particularly, or flock adjacent cameras in their parking lots. Now, oftentimes, those cameras are not accessible to the police in any way without a warrant. And I see those companies and those retail stores, they're using those because their retail theft is so high. And so they have their loss prevention that they allow them to have access to that. And that allows them to track people who are trespassed from the store, who are coming back in and committing thefts continually. So I see a lot of people who they think that, all these cameras are your local police department's cameras. It's honestly quite few. I think now there might be other places who are not like that. I just know from what I've seen, I have seen these cameras in a lot of private lots, and that is a privately owned business. It's a privately owned lot, and those business owners are making the decision that, hey, we want those cameras there for whatever reason, and that's their right to do that. And those are cameras that the police would not have access to without a warrant in any fashion. And I'll say too, another privacy concern there is, I do think it's quite an invasion of privacy. It does seem like quite an intrusion and unreasonable for police departments from other states and agencies to access the cameras of another. I do, I think that, and look, I get it in the sense that, like, you know, crime is while oftentimes it is local to the region, there obviously are major crimes that not only cross, municipalities, but they cross states. For me, though, I just, I feel like it's quite obvious that sharing information, at least across states, to where, because as it stands right now, in Flock, if I wanted to, or many, tons of other police officers in other states and other municipalities, they can just log into Flock, and if there is a camera they need to access that is in another state, and that state or that municipality has allowed access to those cameras, you can just query that data for the last 30 days. That to me seems like an overstep. I think that if at least getting information out of state, and I would say to be conservative, it makes sense to where, officers should only be given access to cameras that are within their jurisdiction. And then if they need access to information from the cameras out of jurisdiction, that they would need to at least, talk to the other agency and give them a reason why. And that data would need to be very specific, or get a warrant to get that information. Because just being able to go in and search that information for people, like for out of, like, literally another state, that seems to be way too far, in my opinion. And I don't, and I think people are rightfully upset about that. Okay, so my ideal solution to where we're at right now, after everything I've said, coming from somebody who uses Flock, and, I feel like I can see its upsides and downsides very personally. It does look to me that the best solution is to deflock. It's just to get rid of all Flock cameras. And let me explain why. I know that's going to piss off a lot of officers, and people might be taken aback by that, but there's a reasoning behind that. So it's clear to me that the reason these cameras, like I said before, have been adopted so quickly and why they're so widespread now is a big issue is there is just such a shortage there's just such a shortage of police officers, and not just police officers, but competent police officers who are productive and very good at their job. And because of that, it's the ramifications of that are starting to be quite obvious. And then when these cameras came around, they did offer a real solution to that problem. They can do a lot of work very quickly. But it's obvious to me that it's just a temporary Band-Aid solution for the real problem, which is a lack of police officers where they need to be, and a lack of support for the police. And it's obvious to me too that this is just the beginning of this technology. And while they might just be automated license plate readers right now, they're clearly collecting more data than that. They're clearly going to features will be starting to roll out that are more than just license plate readers, probably facial recognition, probably software that's able to detect signals from your phone, all types of different sensors. And the end stage of this, it seems to me that it will just compound the problem of less and less officers, and that solution and that problem will not be fixed. And then the solution in place of that will be more technology like this and more invasive tech. And if it gets too far away from us before we properly implement this tech, with proper governance around it, and a proper legal apparatus, I do think it could get out of hand. And that's why it's clear to me people are so worried about it, and I think they're justifiably worried. And I think a lot of police departments, look, these opinions are my own. I do think a lot of police departments have done a very good job at hearing the concerns from the community and trying to make it as transparent as possible, and starting to design their own legal frameworks for it. But it's clear that other police departments have just kind of rushed the rollout on this, and they haven't been doing their due diligence. And Flock certainly, from what I've seen, has not been doing their due diligence, like I've said before, on securing the data on the hardware side and on the software side. And it's sad. It's sad because that's my ideal solution. I don't really see. My hope is that we come to a point where, it's obvious what the solution is in these big cities, and a lot of that, and a big portion of that is we just need more officers, and we need them to be competent officers. We need to have very high standards for them. But sadly, I do see, over the years, I just kind of see this getting worse. I see departments not being properly funded. I see them not getting the staffing that they need. And then I see them relying more and more heavily on these technologies. And I do feel like that'll be to the detriment of the communities they police in the long run. Now, I'm not saying there's a world where, obviously there's a world where this could be done properly. I just think that right now, where these cameras could be used properly, and there could be, an apparatus that the public can look at and feel comfortable and not feel like their rights are being infringed on. And I just think that right now things do feel a little rushed. Now, I say all that because, policing is such a human thing. Policing is every arrest, every detention, every traffic stop, every ticket. I want an officer behind that. I want a real person, a real competent officer who has experience in that role, because every one of those scenarios is unique in upon itself, and I want a human making those decisions. And it does seem like, as time goes on, as technology progresses, as it seems that police's decision making is being further and further restricted, and in place of that, the decision making and the thinking might start to be offloaded to some of these technologies. And like I said before, a lot of these policies are just taking the decision making completely out of police officers' hands at the threat of being fired. Now, I know that was long-winded. I will say too, this is particularly true with your local law enforcement agencies. It doesn't seem to me that I've seen, the feds, they don't seem to have the lack of funding and the lack of manpower and the lack of tech. They seem to have all the tools they need at their disposal to do their job. And I think it's particularly a detriment that it's these local police departments that have been hammered so heavily with this anti-police with these anti-police narratives, and and there's also an issue with, it's not just the police who are having problems too. It's quite clear that there's an issue with a lot of prosecution, with the prosecution and with judges in many of these cities. Prosecutors are having a difficult time, even with all of this new tech and with all of these new developments and evidence, in landing good cases, improving their cases. And we're having issues with, judges giving quite lenient sentences to violent repeat offenders. And at the end of the day, though, the police kind of get the brunt of all of that. They kind of get a lot of that negative feedback, and they see the repercussions on the street. And people don't talk about the issues that the prosecution has and the judges have on that end as well. And they're not really held to the same amount, and they're not held to the same accountability, it seems, as the police often are. But the police cannot do their job without prosecution and without judges. And the prosecutors and the judges cannot do their job without the police. And right now, those factions do seem at odds in many areas, which is just a sad place for us to be in. But I don't want to be a doomer. That's just my opinion. This isn't an all-encompassing video. This is just a few thoughts I've had, having my firsthand experience with the tech. And, I hope that, it kind of adds into the people's insight with it a lot. And I'm saying all this as somebody who, you know, flock and I can say this as somebody who is like, it's obvious to me that if you do get rid of flock, more crime will be unsolved, and there will be more crime. But more crime is already unsolved now, um, and increasing due to a lot of other reasons that are going on in policing right now. Like I said, the manpower issues. It makes total sense for me that, this will probably end up being left to the states. I think it'll probably end up being a state by state. Every state will have their own rulings, probably on like limitations of license plate readers and cameras on public roads. And some states are going to be more lenient on them, and some states might get rid of them altogether. And there is a lot of complicated issues to talk about on both sides. And I'm not here to fence it either. It's just, I truly do think that if police departments had the manpower that they needed, you could get rid of these license plate readers, and crime would absolutely be manageable. But as it stands right now, it's just we have these cities that just do not have enough people and enough officers, and the public is, when I go out and about, my days on patrols, I get a lot of people who they're very concerned about the crime in their area, especially people in the city. I mean, these people are dealing with droves and droves of violent, psychotic, homeless drug addicts. There's people's houses are getting shot up in drive-bys. People's cars are getting broken into. The streets are getting littered. There's graffiti everywhere. Nobody's keeping up with anything anymore. It is quite a sad state, and that's another video. Once again, we're getting into something that I don't want to get too derailed on. But I have another thing to talk about too, though, is, the bar should be very high for the government accessing data like that on public roads. Absolutely. It is kind of interesting to me, though. Like, I think that there is, if you live in a city nowadays, just by nature of living in the city, cities are already quite intrusive into a person's lives. It's quite unnatural at this point. If you're living in a city, pretty much everywhere you go, if you got rid of all flock cameras, all government cameras, and everywhere you go in a city, somebody's got their phone out, somebody's recording a video that you're in, or or there's audio recordings, or you're walking into a store and you're being monitored, and they have all these sensors, and there's video cameras in every store, and you're using a phone to get there, and you're using your Google Maps, and you're using your social media, and literally everything in your pocket to your car, everything, there's already so much data being collected. I do think, as we've talked about, just what law enforcement sees, which is, a picture of the vehicle and its license plate and its direction of travel and its time through the intersection, that's really not a lot I really don't think that's a lot of information. Now, to a good police officer, to a police force, that information is invaluable in solving crime. But just on its face value, like, it's not anywhere to, people are already, using their social media kind of unchecked, and using their phones for all sorts of things that, their data is being packaged and sold to other companies. And so, I'm not saying that that means because your data is being used in so many other areas nefariously that we should turn a blind eye to the flock cameras. It's obviously not what I'm saying. I just do think it is, a point, though, to bring up that, when you're in the city, there is going to be intrusion into your life. Okay? Why do you think, after 7 years now of working in public service and EMS and now police. As soon as I had a kid, I moved out to the country. Okay, I still work in the city, but I moved out as far as I could because I don't want, the cities are rough. They're not what they were even when I was growing up, and I have seen firsthand that I do not want my children. There's really nothing in the city for them. Everything that the city offers, there's really nothing that the city offers that we can't also get out of the city, in the country. And that's a whole other topic in itself. I don't want to get derailed too much. But I think the main thing I kind of wanted to touch on is that I hear a lot of people who say Flock is not as effective as people think. I would venture to say it's probably more effective than people think. I know on Flock's website, they say that they've helped to solve about 20% of closed cases. I don't know where they're querying that number from, how they're getting that data. What I can say is just looking back at my personal cases, it is easily 20%, probably more like 30 to 40%. Flock was used in some way to help solve that crime. And that can be in small and in little ways. It could be, it just helps me identify a clear photo of the car that was involved in a crime, and then maybe I wasn't even using Flock at the time, but I see the car that now that I have a perfect image of it in my head, I see that car parked at a dope house, and I'm able to, do what I need to do to catch that criminal. So I know this is a bit more of one of the serious videos. I try to usually keep it more lighthearted than this, but this is a topic that there's really not much to joke around on. Okay, people are rightfully, this is a serious topic. But anyways, I know that was a lot, guys. I really appreciate you hanging on till the end. Thank you for watching. This was quite a long one. This was quite a serious one too. Please, if there was anything I missed, comment down below. I'm sure we'll do another video related to this in some way. But I kind of wanted to get this one out, kind of get my just initial thoughts and some information out on it. And then we can move on to some other interesting topics. But this is, obviously one that, a lot of people have questions about. And I hope I was able to provide some answers for that. So yeah, thanks for watching, guys.